Today's tale takes us into the neighborhood of Jamaica, in the New York City borough of Queens. It's a story that begins in 1976. Its true details unearthed 43 years later, when the memory of a woman who witnessed something terrible leads to a discovery that would close the books on a long-forgotten cold case. On December 10th, 1976, George Seitz was 81 years old and living at 15912 88th Avenue in Jamaica, Queens. He was 2 days away from his 82nd birthday and decidedly needed a haircut. He would leave his home at around 10 a.m. and make his way to the local barbershop, located at 9042 161st Street. This short walk to the barbershop wasn't unlike many he made before. But this time, he would not return home. He would soon be reported missing by a roommate, and police from the 103rd Precinct would investigate. However, all leads would go cold, and soon, the case would fade. The case at that time received very little fanfare. I wish I could say that I found reports in the news archives about his disappearance at the time, but I have not. An elderly man vanished, a man who was only traveling 3 blocks, and no one had an answer for it. George Clarence Seitz was born December 12, 1894 in New York City. He was born in a period of time referred to as the Lost Generation. These men and women came into adulthood while the First World War was kicking off. Many of them, like George Seitz, going on to serve alongside millions of other U.S. citizens enlisted at that time. George Seitz would serve as an Army corporal during the war and be deployed to France. He, unlike the thousands of U.S. troops who lost their lives due to World War I, would make it back home someday and be able to build a life for himself. His untimely disappearance in December of 1976 would remain a mystery for decades. Monday, March 11th, 2019. An unidentified woman, described as being in her 50s, reaches out to Queens detectives. She has a story to tell them. It's a story that she's bottled up for over 40 years, fearing retribution from who she said committed an atrocious act. She would say that at 11 years old, she was living at the address of 8772 115th Street in the Richmond Hill section of Queens, along with her mother and her mother's boyfriend, Martin Mata. One day, she would witness Mata mopping up a mess in his barbershop and putting remains in trash bags, later seeing him bury some of these bags in the backyard of the home. Was this story true, or some fever dream? Detectives at the 102nd Precinct decided that the woman's story was enough to pursue the case. They would immediately receive a warrant to search the Richmond Hill property, and by the next morning, detectives, the Queens Homicide Squad, and crime scene investigators were at the scene on 115th Street. The NYPD's cadaver dogs would be unleashed into the backyard and give investigators clues that something was in fact buried in a particular spot in the yard. The crew would begin to dig, and just as the woman told them, something would be found. Police would hold a press conference and tell the citizens of New York City that the search of the yard produced partial remains of a human who was placed in bags and interred on the property. They would further say that they believe the case may be linked to a Queens barbershop and that a full homicide investigation would be opened up. However, police would have a long road ahead of them if they wanted to identify exactly who they found beneath the Richmond Hill property. Police would first enter a DNA sample into a local and national database. Unfortunately, their results turned up nothing. They would then go on to seek help from the FBI, knowing that the latest DNA technology used by the federal government far surpassed their capabilities. They hoped that with help from the FBI, investigative genetic genealogy could be performed in order to locate genetic matches. The International Society of Genetic Genealogy says this in regard to investigative genetic genealogy. Investigative genetic genealogy, sometimes also known as forensic genetic genealogy, is the science of using genetic and genealogical methods to generate leads for law enforcement entities investigating crimes and identifying human remains. Genetic genealogists use DNA profiles from a crime scene or from unidentified human remains to identify close genetic DNA profiles or matches. By comparing the known genealogy of those close familial matches, this constrains the number of possible close relatives of the perpetrator or victim. This investigative or forensic genetic genealogy technique came to public attention after the arrest of the so-called Golden State Killer in April of 2018. By October of 2019, more than 60 cold cases have been solved in this manner. The company that would perform the analysis is unearthed Laboratories. This Texas-based lab is at the cutting edge of DNA tech and aids in the hopeful goal of solving the over 200,000 unsolved homicide cases in the United States. They are known as the leading forensic sequencing laboratory for law enforcement and operate outside the traditional CODIS DNA database often used by law enforcement. The investigation into finding relatives of the John Doe found in the Richmond Hill backyard would take over 2 years, when in 2021, authorities finally received DNA matches from Othram Labs. These matches were found within databases such as 23andMe and Ancestry.com, the same ones that everyday Americans submit to in order to generate their own DNA profiles. They would first head out to California and speak to a man in his 80s who confirmed that he had an uncle back in New York that disappeared sometime in the 1970s. They would then visit Ohio and meet with the elderly Gertrude Jones, who explained to authorities that she had been waiting for them for years. She would tell them of her mother's brother, who went missing in Queens and was last seen going to a barber shop. That's when police knew they hit on something big, being that they had similar reports about a barber shop in reference to the case. She would say that her uncle's name was George Seitz, and that he was a World War I veteran, and that he lived with a roommate at his Jamaica, Queens residence, the same roommate who notified authorities of his disappearance. She would go on to say that he was twice married, but never produced any children. At the time of his disappearance, he had a reputation of being a recluse who carried large sums of money on him. Police artists would produce a sketch of what George may have looked like at the time of his disappearance, and eventually, a family member would produce a World War I era image of him. Detectives would continue to key in on the barbershop and the man who owned it. The shop was owned by Martin Mata and his brother Benjamin. As I mentioned previously, the shop was located at 9042 161st Street, just 3 blocks from the residence of George Seitz. The unidentified tipster, who called detectives about what she remembered, said that Martin Mata was the perpetrator of this crime, and she had witnessed his cleanup and his burial. She would also recall her and her mother being threatened by Mata numerous times if they were ever to speak out about what they knew. On Wednesday, November 3rd of 2021, Martin Mata would be indicted on charges of second-degree murder and taken into custody. At the time, he was 74 years old and was found to be staying at a home on 89th Avenue in Jamaica, Queens. Since the incident in December of '76, he had been married and also had children. At his arraignment, New York City would get a look at the suspect police thought was responsible for the now 45-year-old cold case. He appeared elderly, wore glasses, and requested a hearing aid after complaining he could not hear the voice of the judge reading his charges. He would make no statements in regard to what the judge was telling him. Mata would then be remanded without bail and shipped off to Rikers Island. The New York Times would report that they spoke to a woman named Michelle Jones, who ran a hair salon in the same location of the barbershop during the 2010s. The Mata brothers' shop was long gone, but police did question Michelle Jones in 2019 while investigating the location. Michelle Jones would say that she didn't know the brothers, but every once in a while, somebody would ask about them, or go on to tell her stories about their reputation. She would say, quote, "Crazy stuff, that they were into gambling, dogfighting. Oh my God, the stories that I heard." New York City prosecutors were confident in the evidence they had against Martin Mata, and were hoping to prove what would become a monumental case in New York City history. Up until this point, no case in the city's history had ever been solved using this type of forensic genealogy, which led to the reveal of Seitz's identity. In October of 2022, just short of a year since Mata's apprehension, prosecutors would get their wish. Instead of sitting through a trial and attempting to defend himself from a despicable crime he knew he committed, the now 75-year-old Mata would plead guilty to manslaughter, charges which could potentially carry a 20-year sentence for him. We would learn during the trial that Mata knew Seitz for years around the neighborhood, and that he was a regular customer at his barbershop, thus being why he knew he often carried large sums of money on him. Why Mata decided it was a worthwhile venture to end the life of an elderly war veteran for financial gain is beyond me. But that's just what he did on December 10th of 1976, when he attacked George Seitz with a knife in his shop and proceeded to take him apart, burying some of his remains on his property, and the rest, according to court findings, strewn about Queens like trash. On Monday, November 7th of 2022, Martin Mata would be sentenced to 20 years in prison by Queens Supreme Court Justice Kenneth Holder. Judge Kenneth Holder would say this to Mata upon sentencing. "Frankly, you're like Queens' own Jeffrey Dahmer light. I hope your years in prison are hard, terrible years." We would also hear from Gertrude Jones of Ohio. She would say that her mother died never knowing what happened to her brother. Hopefully, she has found solace in the idea that justice was finally served, and that she lived long enough to hear the truth and face down her uncle's killer. Martin Mata is now 76 years old and housed in Erie County, New York's Wend Correctional Facility. He will have to serve a minimum of 15 years and will be eligible for parole in November of 2036, when he will be in his late 80s. Whether he makes it that long is to be seen. At 76 years old, he certainly lived a long life. However, still not as long as the life of 81-year-old war veteran George Seitz, who was sadly taken from the world at the hands of Mata on December the 10th of 1976. Thank you for watching NYC Crime Spot.